The cold steel of her father's revolver pressed against Katherine Norris's temple as the first light of dawn crept across the Montana prairie. Her heart hammered in her chest, but she refused to let the tears fall. She'd never imagined her own father would hold her at gunpoint, but then again, she'd never imagined he'd trade her away like cattle either. "You'll marry Holden or I'll put you in the ground myself," Jeremiah Norris growled, his bloodshot eyes betraying the whiskey courage fueling his rage. "I've signed the papers. The deal is done." It was June 1876 in Silver Creek, Montana Territory, and Katherine Norris had just discovered her worth: 200 acres of prime grazing land and 40 head of cattle. That was the price Jeremiah had accepted from Walter Blackstone, the wealthiest rancher in the county, for his only daughter's hand in marriage to his son Holden. "I won't do it," Katherine said, her voice steadier than her trembling hands. At 22, she was no longer a child to be commanded, though her father seemed to have forgotten that fact. "Holden Blackstone is a monster, and I'll die before I become his wife." The slap came quick and hard, sending Katherine stumbling backward into the rough-hewn dining table. The pain bloomed across her cheek, but she remained upright, glaring at the man who had once carried her on his shoulders through fields of wildflowers. "You ungrateful wretch," Jeremiah spat. "Your mother's been in the ground 3 years, and I've kept this place running by the skin of my teeth. This deal saves our land, puts food on our table." "This deal saves your whiskey supply," Katherine corrected, bitterness seeping into every word. "Don't pretend this is about anything but your debts at the saloon." Her father lunged for her, but Katherine was quicker. She darted toward the door, flinging it open and rushing into the cool morning air. The Norris homestead was modest, a small cabin, a weathered barn, and fenced pastures that had seen better days. Once, it had been enough. Once they had been happy. Katherine ran to the barn, her mind racing. She had 3 days until the wedding. 3 days to escape a fate that made her blood run cold. Holden Blackstone's reputation for cruelty stretched across the territory. His first wife had died under mysterious circumstances barely a year into their marriage, and rumors of his violent temper were common knowledge in Silver Creek. As she flung open the barn door, Katherine collided with a solid wall of muscle. Strong hands steadied her before she could fall. "Whoa there, Miss Norris," came a deep, familiar voice. Katherine looked up into the face of Preston Hayes, the Blackstones' head wrangler. At 26, Preston had worked for the Blackstone Ranch for 5 years, earning a reputation as the finest horseman and most decent man in the county. His sandy brown hair fell in waves beneath his worn Stetson, and his eyes, a startling shade of green, were fixed on her with concern. "Mr. Hayes," Katherine said, stepping back quickly, "I didn't expect anyone to be here. Your father asked me to collect the mare he's trading to Mr. Blackstone," Preston explained, his gaze dropping to the red mark on her cheek. His jaw tightened. "Are you all right, Miss Norris?" "It's nothing," she said automatically, turning away to hide the evidence of her father's temper. Preston didn't press, but something shifted in his expression. "I heard about the arrangement," he said quietly. "Between your father and Mr. Blackstone, you mean my sale." Katherine couldn't keep the bitterness from her voice. 200 acres and 40 head of cattle, apparently that's what I'm worth." "No," Preston said with such firmness that Katherine turned back to face him. "No person has a price tag, Miss Norris, especially not you." There was something in his eyes that made Katherine's breath catch. They'd had only passing interactions over the years, a nod in town, brief exchanges, when he'd come to the Norris property on Blackstone business. But she'd always noticed him. His kindness toward animals and the younger ranch hands. The way he tipped his hat to every woman in town, regardless of her station. The quiet dignity with which he carried himself. "It doesn't matter what you or I think, Mr. Hayes," Katherine said, moving past him to stroke her beloved mare, Willow. "The papers are signed. I'm to be Mrs. Holden Blackstone in 3 days' time." Preston was silent for a long moment. "Unless you weren't here," he finally said, his voice low. Katherine's head snapped up. "What?" I have a sister in Denver, Preston continued, checking over his shoulder to ensure they weren't overheard. She married a good man who owns a millinery shop. They'd take you in, give you honest work until you found your footing. Hope fluttered in Catherine's chest, fragile as a butterfly's wing. Why would you help me? You work for the Blackstones, I work for them. I don't owe them my soul, Preston said grimly, and I can't stand by and watch Holden destroy another woman, his first wife, Clara. He trailed off, his expression darkening. Let's just say her accident wasn't accidental. A chill ran down Catherine's spine. The rumors were true then. I leave tonight, she decided, the words tumbling out before she could reconsider. But I need money and a horse. Take Willow, Preston said. She's still yours until I lead her to the Blackstone Ranch. As for money, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a leather pouch. I've been saving, it's not much, but it'll get you to Denver. Katherine stared at the pouch, then at Preston. Why are you doing this? You could lose your position, or worse. Preston's gaze held hers, unwavering. Some things matter more than a job, Miss Norris. Some things are worth risking everything for. In that moment, with the golden morning light streaming through the barn slats and catching in Preston's earnest eyes, Katherine felt something shift within her, a warmth that had nothing to do with the summer day and everything to do with the man standing before her. Meet me at Widow Jenkins' abandoned cabin at midnight, Preston said, pressing the money into her hand. Pack light, bring only what you need. Katherine nodded, closing her fingers around the pouch. Thank you, she whispered. Preston tipped his hat, a small smile playing at the corner of his mouth. Don't thank me yet, Miss Norris. We've got a long road ahead. As he left the barn, leading a different horse than he had come for, Katherine pressed a hand to her racing heart. For the first time in days, she felt something other than despair, a dangerous, beautiful feeling that felt remarkably like hope. When darkness fell that night, Katherine slipped out of the cabin with nothing but a small satchel containing a change of clothes, her mother's silver hairbrush, and a daguerreotype of her parents from happier times. Her father had passed out hours earlier, a half-empty bottle of whiskey still clutched in his hand. She made her way to the barn, saddled Willow, and rode through the moonlit fields toward Widow Jenkins' cabin. The old place had stood empty since its owner had passed 2 winters prior, becoming a landmark for locals rather than a home. As she approached, Katherine spotted a figure standing beside 2 saddled horses. Her heart leapt, but as she drew closer, confusion set in. Preston had said he would meet her, but he'd said nothing about bringing company. When she dismounted, Preston stepped forward, his expression grave. There's been a complication, he said without preamble. Holden returned early from Butt. He's looking for me and he's asking about you. Fear gripped Katherine's throat. Does he suspect? No, but he will when we're both missing come morning. Preston ran a hand through his hair. We need to change our plans. Denver's too far with them on our trail. We need somewhere closer to disappear. Katherine echoed. Preston's expression softened. I can't send you off alone, Miss Norris, not now. If you'll have me as your escort, I aim to see you safely wherever you decide to go. The realization of what he was offering struck her like a physical blow. You're giving up everything, she said. Your job, your reputation. A job working for men I can't respect and a reputation in a town I don't mind leaving? Preston shook his head. Not much of a sacrifice. A noise from the trees set them both on edge. Preston's hand went to his pistol. Easy, came a voice, and a slender figure emerged from the shadows. It's just me. Eliza, Preston exhaled in relief. You're late. The young woman approaching them was familiar to Katherine, Eliza Dawson, the schoolteacher who had come to Silver Creek the previous year. With her honey-colored hair and spectacles, she looked every inch the proper educator, though Katherine knew from town gossip that she'd fled some scandal back east. I had to wait until Mrs. Perkins was asleep, Eliza explained, handing a bundle to Preston. I brought what you asked for: food, bandages, and this. She produced a folded document from her pocket. My cousin works for the railroad in Helena. This letter identifies you as Mr. and Mrs. Smith, traveling to visit family in Idaho Territory. Mr. and Mrs. Katherine questioned, her cheeks warming despite the cool night air. Preston looked uncomfortable. It's safer for a woman to travel with a husband, he explained. Less questions. Eliza nodded. He's right. Two unmarried people traveling together will draw attention we don't want. Her expression turned serious as she addressed Katherine. Preston told me about your situation. I want you to know I think you're very brave. Katherine wasn't sure how to respond. Until this moment, running away had felt like cowardice necessary, but shameful nonetheless. To hear it called brave was disorienting. Thank you for your help, she finally said. Where will you go? Eliza asked. Preston and Katherine exchanged glances. We haven't decided, Preston admitted. My brother has a homestead near Fort Benton, Eliza offered. It's 3 days' hard ride, but he's a good man who asks few questions. You could stay there while deciding your next move. It wasn't Denver, but it was a destination and one far enough from Silver Creek to offer some safety. Katherine nodded. Fort Benton it is. They transferred Katherine's few belongings to the fresh horse. Preston had brought a sturdy bay gelding that wouldn't tire as quickly as Willow over long distances. The mare would be returned to the Norris property with a note indicating Katherine had fled alone, hopefully buying Preston a day's head start before suspicion fell on him. As they prepared to depart, Eliza embraced Katherine. Be careful, she whispered. And remember you're worth far more than land and cattle. With those words ringing in her ears, Katherine mounted her horse and followed Preston into the darkness, leaving behind the only home she had ever known and riding toward an uncertain future that, despite its dangers, felt infinitely more hopeful than the one that had awaited her in Silver Creek. They rode through the night, keeping to game trails and avoiding the main roads. Preston set a brisk pace, his eyes constantly scanning their surroundings for signs of pursuit. By dawn, they had covered nearly 20 miles, and both horses and riders were exhausted. We'll rest here, Preston decided, guiding them to a small clearing beside a creek. The spot was well concealed by cottonwoods, offering shade and water while keeping them hidden from any travelers on the distant road. As Katherine dismounted, her legs buckled beneath her. She hadn't ridden such distances since she was a girl, and her muscles protested the sudden exertion. Preston was at her side in an instant, strong hands supporting her elbows. Easy now, he murmured. You should rest. I'll tend to the horses. I'm not helpless, Mr. Hayes, Katherine said, though she was grateful for his steadying presence. Preston's mouth curved into a smile. Preston, he corrected. If we're to be Mr. and Mrs. Smith, you might as well use my Christian name. Preston, Katherine repeated, testing the feel of it on her tongue. It suited him strong and straightforward like the man himself. And I'm Katherine. Katherine, he echoed, his voice softening on the syllables in a way that sent an unexpected shiver through her. For a moment they stood too close, the morning air charged with something Katherine couldn't name. Then Preston cleared his throat and stepped back. I'll see to the horses. While he unsaddled and watered their mounts, Katherine unpacked the food Eliza had provided: bread, cheese, dried beef, and apples. A feast compared to what she'd expected for their journey. As they ate, sitting side by side on a fallen log, Katherine studied Preston's profile. In the soft morning light, she could see the fine lines at the corners of his eyes, evidence of years squinting against the Montana sun, and the slight cleft in his chin that she'd never noticed before. You're risking everything for a woman you barely know, she said quietly. I still don't understand why, Preston chewed thoughtfully before answering. I told you about Holden's first wife, Clara, Katherine nodded. What I didn't say was that Clara was my cousin, Preston continued, his voice low. We grew up together in Missouri. After the war, my family had nothing left. Clara married Holden because his father promised to bring her parents and siblings west, give them a fresh start. His jaw tightened. Blackstone kept his word. He brought them out, put them to work like slaves on his ranch. When Clara complained, Holden beat her. When she threatened to leave, she had her accident. Horror washed over Katherine. "I'm so sorry," she whispered. "I came west to find her," Preston said. "By the time I arrived, she was already gone. I took the job with Blackstone to support her family, help them save enough to leave." His eyes met Katherine's. "They finally did last month. Headed to Oregon. I was planning to follow once I'd settled my affairs." "And then my father made his deal with Blackstone," Katherine realized. Preston nodded. "I couldn't let it happen again, not if I could prevent it." They fell silent, the weight of his confession hanging between them. Katherine wanted to reach for his hand, offer some comfort for the pain she saw etched in his features, but hesitated. Despite their current circumstances fleeing together, posing as husband and wife, they were still virtual strangers. "We should get moving," Preston finally said, rising to his feet. "We've got a lot of ground to cover before nightfall." They packed quickly and resumed their journey, keeping to the wilderness where possible. As the day wore on, Katherine found herself studying Preston's straight back as he rode ahead of her, the confidence in his posture, the gentle way he handled his horse, the vigilance with which he watched for danger. He was unlike any man she had ever known. By late afternoon, they had crossed into a region of rolling hills that Preston said marked the halfway point to Fort Benton. The landscape was beautiful, vast stretches of prairie grass rippling like golden waves in the breeze, punctuated by stands of pine and aspen. In different circumstances, Katherine might have enjoyed the journey. As the sun began its descent, Preston guided them toward a small valley where a dilapidated cabin stood beside a lazy stream. "Trapper's cabin," he explained as they approached. "Abandoned years ago, but the roof sound. Better than sleeping under the stars with rain coming." Sure enough, dark clouds were building on the horizon, promising a wet night ahead. Katherine was grateful for the shelter, humble though it might be. The cabin's interior was sparse: a stone fireplace, a rough-hewn table with a single chair, and a narrow cot pushed against one wall. Preston immediately set about gathering wood for a fire while Katherine brushed down the horses and secured them in a lean-to attached to the cabin. By the time darkness fell, rain was pattering against the cabin's roof, but inside was warm and surprisingly cozy. Preston had built a fire that cast dancing shadows on the log walls, and they shared another meal from their provisions. "You should take the cot," Preston said as they finished eating. "I'll sleep by the fire." Katherine glanced at the narrow bed, then back at Preston. "You're too tall for the floor, we could." She faltered, her cheeks warming. "We could share. The cot, I mean, it's big enough if we're careful." Preston's eyebrows rose, and for a moment, Katherine feared she'd scandalized him. But then he smiled, a gentle expression that reached his eyes. "That's kind of you, but I've slept on harder ground than this. You take the bed." Too exhausted to argue, Katherine nodded. She turned away to change into her nightdress, acutely aware of Preston's presence even though he respectfully faced the fire. When she slipped under the thin blanket on the cot, she watched as Preston spread his bedroll on the floor nearby. "Preston," she said softly. He looked up, his face half illuminated by the firelight. "Thank you for everything," he nodded, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Get some rest, Katherine. Tomorrow will be another long day." As she drifted towards sleep, lulled by the sound of rain on the roof and Preston's steady breathing, Katherine realized that despite the uncertainty of their situation, or perhaps because of it, she felt safer than she had in years. With that comforting thought, she surrendered to exhaustion. She woke to the smell of coffee and the sound of quiet movement. Dawn light filtered through the cabin's single window, casting a pale glow over Preston as he stoked the fire. He had already dressed and, from the dampness of his hair, had washed in the stream despite the cool morning. "Morning," he said when he noticed her watching. "Hope I didn't wake you." "No," Katherine sat up, conscious of her disheveled appearance. "I should get ready. We need to keep moving." Preston nodded, offering her a tin cup of coffee. "Take your time. I want to check our back trail before we set out." While Preston stepped outside, Katherine quickly dressed and packed her few belongings. The coffee was strong and hot, reviving her spirits after the deep sleep of exhaustion. By the time Preston returned, she felt ready to face another day on the trail. "Any sign of pursuit?" she asked. Preston's expression was grim. "Smoke to the south, could be a campfire, could be nothing. Or it could be them," Katherine finished the thought. "We need to pick up our pace," Preston agreed. "If we push hard, we can reach the Missouri River by nightfall. Once we cross, we'll be harder to track." They set out immediately, riding at a faster clip than the previous day. Katherine could feel Preston's tension in the set of his shoulders, and the frequent glances he cast behind them. His concern was contagious, and she found herself straining to hear hoofbeats over the rhythm of their own horses' movement. Around midday, as they paused to water the horses at a small creek, the distant sound of a gunshot froze them both. "Hunters," Katherine suggested hopefully. Preston's expression said he thought otherwise. "Mount up." Now, they rode hard for the next hour, pushing the horses to their limits. Katherine's thighs burned and her back ached, but fear was a powerful motivator. She kept pace with Preston without complaint as they climbed higher into pine-covered hills that offered better concealment. As the afternoon waned, they crested a ridge that gave them their first view of the Missouri River, a wide, meandering band of water cutting through the landscape below. The sight would have been breathtaking if Katherine hadn't been so focused on reaching it before their pursuers caught up. "There's a ferry crossing 5 miles downstream," Preston said, pointing to where the river curved around a bluff. "If we're lucky, we can make it before sunset." They urged their tired horses down the slope, but they'd gone less than a mile when Preston suddenly raised his hand, signaling a halt. He cocked his head, listening. "Riders," he said tersely, "coming fast." Katherine's heart hammered in her chest. "How many?" "Can't tell, at least 3. Preston scanned their surroundings, then pointed to a dense stand of pines off to their right. "There, we need cover." They guided their horses into the trees, just as the sound of hoofbeats became clear even to Katherine's untrained ear. Preston dismounted quickly, helping Katherine down before leading both horses deeper into the woods, where they wouldn't be visible from the trail. "Stay here," he whispered, drawing his revolver. "If anything happens to me, take the horses and keep going north. The ferryman's name is Olson. Tell him you're Eliza Dawson's friend and he'll help you." "I'm not leaving you," Katherine protested, her voice low but fierce. Preston met her gaze, something unreadable flickering in his green eyes. Then, without warning, he reached out and cupped her cheek with his free hand. "You're the bravest woman I've ever known, Katherine Norris," he murmured. "But right now I need you to be safe more than I need you to be brave." Before she could respond, he slipped away through the trees, moving silently toward the edge of the woods where he could observe the trail. Katherine held her breath, straining to hear over the pounding of her own pulse. The hoofbeats grew louder, then slowed. Men's voices carried on the air, too distant to make out words, but the tone was unmistakably angry. Minutes stretched like hours as Katherine waited, one hand on her mare's bridle to keep the nervous animal quiet. When a twig snapped nearby, she whirled, expecting to see Preston returning. Instead, she found herself staring into the cold eyes of Holden Blackstone. "Well now," Holden drawled, his thin lips stretching into a smile that never reached his eyes. "What have we here?" "The runaway bride herself." Katherine backed away, her grip tightening on Willow's reins. "Stay away from me." "Or what?" Holden laughed, a harsh sound devoid of humor. "You'll run again?" "I don't think so, darling. Your father signed a contract and I aim to collect what's mine." "I belong to no one," Katherine said, fighting to keep her voice steady. "We'll see about that." Holden took a step toward her. "Where's Hayes? I know he's with you. My men saw 2 sets of tracks." "I don't know what you're talking about," Katherine lied. "I'm alone." Holden's smile vanished. "Don't lie to me, girl. Hayes disappeared the same night you did. The tracks don't lie either." He reached for her arm. "Now, we can do this the easy way," or a gunshot cracked the air, and Holden jerked back with a cry of pain, clutching his shoulder. Blood seeped between his fingers as he staggered against a tree. "Step away from her," came Preston's voice, cold and commanding. Katherine turned to see him emerging from the trees, his revolver trained steadily on Holden. "You're dead, Hayes," Holden snarled through gritted teeth. "My father will see you hang for this." "Maybe," Preston acknowledged. "But you'll be dead a whole lot sooner if you don't tell your men to back off. Now." Holden's eyes narrowed, calculating, then he raised his voice. "Stand down, boys, I'm hit." Rustling in the underbrush suggested men moving away. Preston didn't lower his gun. "Katherine, get on your horse," he instructed, his gaze never leaving Holden. She didn't need to be told twice. With shaking hands, she mounted Willow, watching as Preston backed toward his own horse, keeping Holden covered. "This isn't over, Hayes," Holden spat. "A bullet's too quick for what I've got planned for you." "Looking forward to it," Preston replied coolly, swinging onto his horse in one fluid motion. "Katherine, ride," they burst from the trees, galloping down the slope toward the river. Behind them came shouts and then, moments later, the thunder of pursuing hoofbeats. "Don't stop," Preston called as they raced across open ground. Straight for the ferry, the Missouri loomed larger as they approached, its waters swift and churning. At the ferry crossing, a flat wooden barge was moored to the near shore, an older man in suspenders looking up in surprise at their headlong approach. "Olson," Preston shouted. "Get ready to cast off," understanding dawned on the ferryman's weathered face. He began loosening the mooring ropes even as Preston and Katherine clattered onto the wooden deck of the ferry, their horses' hooves loud on the planking. "Trouble following?" Olson asked, glancing at the riders appearing on the ridge above. "The worst kind," Preston confirmed, dismounting quickly to help with the ropes. "How fast can this thing move?" "Fast enough with the current," Olson said, pushing the ferry away from the bank with a long pole. "Hold those horses steady." Katherine clung to both sets of reins, soothing the nervous animals as the ferry began to drift into the current. On the bank they just left, Holden and 3 riders reined to a stop, cursing loudly. "Hayes," Holden roared across the water. "I'll find you. Wherever you go, I'll find you." Preston stood tall on the deck, his expression impassive as the distance between them grew. Only when they reached the middle of the river did he turn to Katherine. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice gentle now that they were out of immediate danger. Katherine nodded, though she couldn't stop trembling. "You shot him," she said, still processing what had happened. "Just winged him," Preston replied. "Enough to slow him down, not enough to kill him," he sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Though I'm not sure that was wise. A dead man can't follow us." "You're not a killer," Katherine said with certainty. Preston's gaze met hers, something vulnerable flickering in their depths. "I've killed before. During the war, I know what it costs." He shook his head slightly. "I won't take a life unless there's no other choice." The ferry bumped against the far shore and Olson secured it to a weathered post. "You folks best keep moving," the ferryman advised, eyeing the angry men on the opposite bank. "They'll have to ride 10 miles upstream to the next crossing, but they won't give up easy." Preston nodded, pressing coins into the man's palm. "We're obliged to you." "Any friend of Eliza's," Olson said with a wink. "There's a trading post 3 miles north, Mapleton's place. Tell him Olson sent you and he'll put you up for the night." With renewed urgency, they mounted their horses and set off along the narrow trail leading away from the river. As they rode, Katherine glanced back once to see Holden and his men already moving upstream, just as Olson had predicted. "They're not giving up," she observed grimly. "No," Preston agreed, "but we've bought ourselves some time, and we're getting close to Fort Benton." They reached Mapleton's trading post just as dusk was settling over the land. The establishment was larger than Katherine had expected, a main building constructed of squared logs, several outbuildings, and a corral containing a dozen horses. Smoke curled invitingly from the stone chimney, and lantern light gleamed from the windows. A large man with a bushy beard emerged as they approached, a shotgun resting casually in the crook of his arm. "Help you folks?" he called. Olson sent us, Preston replied. Said you might have a place we could sleep tonight. The man, presumably Mapleton, lowered his shotgun and stepped closer, studying them with shrewd eyes. Olson, eh? That old river rat still charging double for Sunday crossings? Wouldn't know, Preston said carefully. We crossed today. Mapleton's serious expression broke into a grin. Just testing. Olson's never worked a Sunday in his life. He jerked his head toward the buildings. Got a room above the store for travelers. Wife'll fix you something to eat. His gaze lingered on their dusty, travel-worn appearance. Looks like you could use it. Inside, the trading post was warm and well-stocked, with shelves of canned goods, tools, bolts of fabric, and other necessities. A plump woman with kind eyes introduced herself as Martha Mapleton and immediately set about preparing a meal while her husband showed them to a small but clean room upstairs. Washrooms down the hall, Mapleton said, lighting a lamp on a simple dresser. There's a lock on the door, but you won't need it. Nobody bothers travelers here. When he'd gone, Preston sank onto the room's single chair with a weary sigh. We should be safe for tonight, but we'll leave at first light. Katherine nodded, sitting on the edge of the narrow bed. How much further to Fort Benton? A day's ride if the weather holds, Preston said. Maybe less. The reality of their situation settled over Katherine like a physical weight. In just 2 days, they had fled her home, been pursued across miles of wilderness, and witnessed violence she'd never imagined experiencing firsthand. And through it all, this man, this virtual stranger who had risked everything for her, had remained steadfast. Why are you looking at me like that? Preston asked, his voice soft in the lamplight. Katherine hadn't realized she'd been staring. I was just thinking that I don't know how I'll ever repay you for what you've done. Preston shook his head. This isn't about debt, Katherine. Then what is it about? He was silent for a long moment, his eyes holding hers in the golden light. Doing what's right, he finally said. And maybe something more than that. Before Katherine could ask what he meant, a knock at the door announced Martha with a tray of food rabbit stew, fresh bread, and 2 mugs of hot coffee. The interruption broke the moment, but as they ate, Katherine found herself stealing glances at Preston, wondering at the unspoken words that had hung between them. After the meal, Preston excused himself to check on the horses, leaving Katherine alone in the room. She took advantage of the washroom down the hall, luxuriating in the simple pleasure of hot water and soap after 2 days on the trail. When she returned to the room, dressed in her nightgown and wrapper, Preston still hadn't returned. Concerned, she made her way downstairs to find him standing at the trading post's counter with Mapleton, studying a map spread between them. There's a shortcut through these hills, Mapleton was saying, his thick finger tracing a route. Cuts half a day off the journey to Fort Benton, but it's rough going, not a trail for tenderfeet. We'll manage, Preston assured him, glancing up as Katherine approached. Katherine, Mr. Mapleton says there's a faster way to Fort Benton. And he also says there were riders asking after you at Jensen's place 10 miles back, Martha added, emerging from the back room with a worried expression. 4 men, one with a wounded shoulder. Preston's jaw tightened. How long ago? Couple hours, Mapleton said. Jensen sent his boy to warn us, said they were offering good money for information. Did he tell them anything? Katherine asked, fear coiling in her stomach. Jensen? Nah. Mapleton shook his head. He hates the Blackstones on principle. Wouldn't piss on Walter Blackstone if he was on fire, begging your pardon, madam. Despite the crude language, Katherine felt a surge of gratitude for the unknown Jensen. So they don't know we're here? Not yet, Mapleton confirmed, but they're getting close. You folks might want to consider pushing on tonight. Preston shook his head. The horses need rest, and so does Katherine. We'll leave before dawn. He turned to Mapleton. Is there anywhere we can hole up if they do come this way? The trader considered for a moment. Got a root cellar behind the store. Entrance is hidden under a woodpile. If trouble comes, you can hide there. Let's hope it doesn't come to that, Martha said, patting Katherine's hand. Now you look dead on your feet, dear. Go get some sleep while you can." Upstairs, Preston insisted on taking the chair, leaving the bed for Katherine. Too exhausted to argue, she slipped under the quilt, watching as Preston cleaned his revolver by lamplight, his movements precise and practiced. "You think they'll find us?" she asked quietly. Preston looked up, his expression unreadable in the dim light. "Maybe, but we've got a head start and good people helping us." He set the revolver aside. "Try not to worry, Katherine. I won't let anything happen to you." "It's not me I'm worried about," she admitted. "You shot Holden Blackstone. If they catch us, they'll kill you." Preston was silent for a long moment. "Some things are worth dying for," he finally said, his voice so low Katherine barely caught the words. Before she could respond, he blew out the lamp, plunging the room into darkness. Katherine lay awake for some time, listening to Preston's breathing across the small space, wondering what he'd meant. As sleep claimed her, one thought remained. Whatever happened tomorrow, whatever dangers awaited them on the road to Fort Benton, she was no longer alone in facing them. The next thing Katherine knew, Preston was shaking her gently awake. The room was still dark, but there was a sense of urgency in his movements. "Time to go," he whispered. "It's an hour before dawn." They dressed quickly and made their way downstairs, where Mapleton was waiting with provisions: bread, cheese, dried meat, and a canteen of fresh water. Their horses were already saddled in the yard, dancing with nervous energy in the pre-dawn chill. "Take the North Trail like we discussed," Mapleton instructed Preston. "Keep the North Star at your back until sunrise, then follow the creek. You'll hit the shortcut to Fort Benton by mid-morning." "We're in your debt," Preston said, clasping the trader's hand firmly. Mapleton shook his head. "No debt between friends. Just do right by this young lady, and we'll call it square." They mounted quickly and set off into the darkness, guided only by starlight and Preston's woodsman instincts. The terrain was challenging, rocky hillsides and dense stands of pine that required careful navigation. Katherine followed Preston's lead, trusting his judgment even when the trail seemed to disappear entirely. As the first light of dawn crept across the eastern sky, they paused on a ridge overlooking the path they'd traveled. In the distance, the trading post was just visible, a smudge of buildings against the landscape. There was no sign of pursuit, but Preston remained vigilant, his eyes constantly scanning the horizon. "We're making good time," he said as they rested the horses briefly. "If we keep this pace, we'll reach Fort Benton by nightfall." Katherine nodded, taking a sip from the canteen. The water was cool and refreshing, easing the dryness in her throat. "What happens when we get there? To Eliza's brother's place, I mean," Preston considered the question. "We'll stay long enough to make sure we've lost Blackstone. Then," he hesitated. "That depends on you, I suppose. Where do you want to go?" It was a question Katherine hadn't allowed herself to consider fully. In the rush of their escape, she'd been focused solely on getting away from Silver Creek and the fate that awaited her there. Beyond that, the future remained a blank canvas. "I don't know," she admitted. "I have some schooling. I could teach, perhaps, or work in a shop." She glanced at Preston. "What about you? You said you were planning to follow Clara's family to Oregon." A shadow crossed Preston's face at the mention of his cousin. "That was the plan," he agreed. "Still might be." "Oh," Katherine felt an unexpected pang at the thought of Preston continuing west without her. Which was ridiculous, she told herself firmly. He had already done far more for her than she had any right to expect. Once they reached safety, they would go their separate ways, he to Oregon and his family, she to wherever life took her. They resumed their journey in thoughtful silence, following the creek Mapleton had described. The land grew increasingly rugged as they traveled, with steep ravines and rocky outcroppings that slowed their progress. By midday, they had reached the shortcut, a narrow pass between two hills that opened onto a broader valley. "There," Preston said, pointing ahead where a thin column of smoke rose against the sky. "That's the Blackfoot camp Mapleton mentioned. We skirt around to the east, keep our distance." Katherine nodded, following his lead as they guided their horses along the edge of the valley, staying within the tree line to avoid being spotted. The native encampment was larger than she'd expected, with dozens of tipis arranged in a semicircle. Men, women, and children moved about their daily tasks, unaware of the travelers observing from a distance. "Have you had dealings with the Blackfoot before?" Katherine asked quietly as they watched. "Some," Preston replied. "They're generally peaceful these days, especially this band. But they've had troubles with white settlers taking their hunting grounds. Best not to test their hospitality unnecessarily." They continued eastward, giving the camp a wide berth. The afternoon wore on, and Katherine found herself growing increasingly uncomfortable in the saddle. They had ridden hard for 3 days with minimal rest, and her body, unused to such punishment, was protesting vigorously. Preston seemed to notice her discomfort. "We'll rest soon," he promised. "There's a stream ahead where we can water the horses and stretch our legs." The stream, when they reached it, was a welcome sight: clear water bubbling over smooth stones, bordered by cottonwoods that offered shade from the afternoon sun. As Katherine dismounted, her legs nearly buckled beneath her. Preston was at her side instantly, supporting her with a strong arm around her waist. "Easy," he murmured. "You're not used to this much riding." "I'm fine," Katherine insisted, though she was grateful for his steadying presence. "Just stiff." "Walking will help," Preston said, keeping his arm around her as they led the horses to the water's edge. "You've held up remarkably well, considering." There was admiration in his voice that made Katherine glance up at him, catching an expression in his eyes that sent warmth spreading through her chest. For a moment, they stood too close, his arm still circling her waist, her hand resting on his chest where she'd placed it to steady herself. "Preston," she began, uncertain what she wanted to say but feeling that something needed to be spoken aloud. The sharp crack of a rifle shot shattered the moment. Katherine gasped as dirt kicked up just inches from her feet. "Down." Preston commanded, pulling her to the ground behind a fallen tree. "Stay low." Another shot rang out, splintering bark from a tree near their heads. The horses whinnied in terror, pulling at their reins where Preston had hastily tied them to a sapling. "Where are they?" Katherine whispered, her heart hammering in her chest. "Ridge to the west," Preston replied, peering carefully over their makeshift shelter. "I count 2 shooters, probably sent ahead while the main group follows our trail." "What do we do?" Preston's expression was grim as he drew his revolver. "We're pinned down here. They've got the high ground and rifles." He glanced at the panicking horses. "If they spook the horses into running, we're on foot in hostile territory." As if on cue, another shot cracked the air, deliberately aimed near the horses. Willow reared in terror, her hooves flailing as she fought against her tether. "I need to get to the horses," Preston decided. "When I move, they'll focus on me. You stay here, keep your head down." "No," Katherine grabbed his arm. "It's too dangerous." "We don't have a choice," Preston said firmly. "On foot, we're as good as captured." Before Katherine could protest further, Preston rolled away from their shelter and sprinted toward the horses, zigzagging to make himself a difficult target. Shots peppered the ground around him as the hidden riflemen tracked his movement. Katherine watched in horror as Preston reached the horses, trying to calm the panicked animals while bullets whizzed past. He managed to untie them, but as he turned to lead them back toward cover, a shot cracked and he stumbled, clutching his side. "Preston," Katherine screamed, forgetting all caution as she saw him fall to one knee. Despite his injury, Preston maintained his grip on the reins, preventing the horses from bolting. He looked up at her cry, his face pale but determined. "Stay down," he shouted. Instead, Katherine ran to him, ducking low as more shots kicked up dirt around her. When she reached Preston, she saw blood seeping between the fingers pressed to his side. "You're hit," she gasped. "Just grazed," he ground out, though his ashen complexion told a different story. "Help me up." Together, they managed to get Preston onto his horse, Katherine mounting Willow beside him. With bullets still flying, they urged their horses forward, away from the stream and into the dense trees beyond. The rifle fire followed them briefly, then fell silent as they disappeared into the forest. They rode hard for several minutes, putting distance between themselves and their attackers. When they finally slowed, Katherine could see that Preston was swaying in his saddle, his shirt dark with blood. "We need to stop," she insisted. "You're bleeding too much." "Can't stop yet," Preston said through gritted teeth. "They'll be following." "You'll bleed to death if we don't tend that wound," Katherine argued. "There." She pointed to a rocky overhang ahead. "We can shelter there just long enough for me to bandage you up." Too weak to argue further, Preston nodded, allowing Katherine to guide them to the natural shelter. Once there, she helped him dismount and eased him to the ground, his back against the rock face. "Let me see," she said, gently pulling his hand away from the wound. The bullet had torn through the flesh of his side, leaving a deep furrow that bled freely but didn't appear to have hit anything vital. Still, the blood loss was significant, and infection was a deadly risk in the wilderness. "In my saddlebag," Preston directed, his voice strained. "Bandages and a flask of whiskey." Katherine retrieved the items along with a canteen of water. Working quickly, she cleaned the wound as best she could, trying not to flinch at Preston's sharp intake of breath when she poured whiskey over the torn flesh. "I'm sorry," she murmured. "I know it hurts." "Had worse," Preston managed, though sweat beaded on his forehead from the pain. Katherine bandaged the wound tightly, using strips of clean cotton from the supplies Eliza had provided. When she finished, Preston's color was marginally better, but he was clearly in no condition to ride far. "You should go on without me," he said, reading her concerned expression. "Fort Benton is less than 10 miles north. Follow the river, you can't miss it." "I'm not leaving you," Katherine said firmly. "We'll rest here until you're stronger, then continue together." Preston shook his head. "Blackstone's men will be tracking us. If they find us here, we're done for." "Then we'll hide somewhere else," Katherine insisted. "But I am not leaving you behind, not after everything you've done for me." The stubbornness in her voice must have convinced him, for Preston didn't argue further. Instead, he closed his eyes, leaning his head back against the rock. "Just a short rest," he conceded. "Then we move on." While Preston rested, Katherine kept watch, her hand on the revolver he had insisted she take. The forest was quiet save for the occasional call of a bird or rustle of leaves in the breeze. No sign of pursuit yet, but Katherine knew it was only a matter of time. She studied Preston's face as he dozed fitfully, noting the lines of pain etched around his mouth, the dark smudges beneath his eyes. In just a few days, this man had become more important to her than anyone since her mother's passing. The thought of losing him sent a wave of cold fear through her veins. When Preston stirred an hour later, his color was better, though pain still shadowed his eyes as he straightened. "How do you feel?" Katherine asked. "Like I've been shot," he replied with a weak attempt at humor. "But I can ride." He glanced at the darkening sky. "We should move, it'll be night soon." Katherine helped him to his feet, steadying him when he swayed slightly. "Maybe we should find somewhere to camp for the night," she suggested. "You're in no condition to keep riding." Preston shook his head stubbornly. "Too dangerous to stop. Fort Benton is close. We push on." There was no arguing with the determination in his voice. Katherine helped him mount his horse, noting with concern how he gritted his teeth against the pain the movement caused. Once they were both in their saddles, they set off at a slower pace than before, heading north toward the Missouri River that would lead them to Fort Benton. The landscape grew darker as twilight descended, making travel increasingly treacherous. Katherine rode close to Preston, watching worriedly as he fought to stay upright in the saddle. His breathing had grown labored, and she suspected fever was setting in, a dangerous sign. Just as the last light was fading from the sky, they crested a hill and saw the twinkling lights of Fort Benton spread along the banks of the Missouri River. The sight gave Katherine a surge of hope. They had made it against all odds. "Look, Preston," she said, pointing. "Fort Benton." "We're almost there." Preston raised his head, his eyes focusing on the distant lights. A faint smile crossed his pale features. "Told you we'd make it," he murmured. They urged their tired horses forward, descending toward the settlement. Fort Benton was larger than Katherine had expected, a proper town with wooden buildings, streets laid out in a grid, and the bustle of commerce evident even at this hour. Steamboats were moored along the riverfront, a testament to the town's importance as a trading post. "Eliza said her brother lives on the north side," Preston said, his voice strained with the effort of staying conscious. "Near the smithy." They rode through the town, drawing curious glances from passers-by who noted their dusty, travel-worn appearance and Preston's obvious injury. Katherine kept her head high, ignoring the stares as she searched for the smithy Eliza had mentioned. They found it near the edge of town, a large building with an open forge still glowing red in the growing darkness. Beside it stood a modest house with smoke curling from the chimney and lamplight gleaming from the windows. As they approached, the door opened, and a man stepped out, tall and broad-shouldered, with the same honey-colored hair as Eliza, though his was streaked with gray at the temples. "Can I help you folks?" he called, his hand resting casually near the pistol at his hip. "Are you Thomas Dawson?" Katherine asked, reining Willow to a stop. "Eliza Dawson's brother." The man's posture shifted slightly, wariness replacing open suspicion. "Who's asking?" "My name is Katherine Norris. This is Preston Hayes. Your sister sent us. She said you might be able to help us." Thomas studied them for a long moment, his gaze lingering on Preston's bloodied shirt and pallid complexion. Then he stepped forward, his expression softening. "Eliza sent word you might be coming," he said. "Though she didn't mention one of you would be bleeding all over my yard." He moved to Preston's side, reaching up to steady him as he swayed in the saddle. "Let's get you inside before you fall off that horse." With Thomas's help, they got Preston into the house, where a woman, presumably Thomas's wife, gasped at the sight of him but immediately began clearing space on a sofa near the fire. "Sarah, get my kit," Thomas instructed as he eased Preston onto the sofa. "And water, hot as you can make it." While Sarah hurried to comply, Thomas turned to Katherine. "Eliza's letter said you were in trouble. Blackstone trouble specifically?" Katherine nodded, sinking into a chair as the events of the past days caught up with her. "My father traded me to Walter Blackstone's son for land and cattle," she explained, the words bitter on her tongue. "Preston helped me escape. We've been running for 4 days, and Holden Blackstone and his men have been hunting us. They shot Preston this afternoon." Thomas's expression darkened. "Blackstone's reach is long, even up here." He glanced at Preston, who was being tended by Sarah with gentle efficiency. "But you're safe now. Blackstone may own half of Silver Creek, but he doesn't own Fort Benton." Katherine felt tears pricking at her eyes, the first she'd allowed herself since their flight began. "Thank you," she whispered. Thomas patted her shoulder awkwardly. "No need for thanks. Any friend of my sister's is welcome here." He studied her exhausted face. "You look dead on your feet, Miss Norris. Sarah will show you where you can wash up and rest once she's done patching up your friend." While Sarah cleaned and rebandaged Preston's wound properly, Thomas brought Katherine a mug of strong coffee and a plate of stew that she devoured gratefully. The warmth and safety of the Dawson home was a stark contrast to the danger and uncertainty of the past days. When Sarah had finished with Preston, she led Katherine to a small bedroom off the main living area. "You can sleep here," she said kindly. "There are clean clothes in the dresser that should fit you. They belonged to our daughter before she married and moved to Helena." The promise of clean clothes and a real bed nearly undid Katherine's composure completely. "How can I ever repay your kindness?" she asked, her voice thick with emotion. Sarah smiled, her eyes crinkling at the corners. "You already have by bringing us news of Eliza. We worry about her off on her own in Silver Creek." She patted Katherine's hand. "Now get some rest. We'll talk more in the morning." After washing away the grime of travel with hot water from a pitcher and basin, Katherine changed into a borrowed nightgown and sank into the bed. Despite her exhaustion, sleep eluded her as her mind churned with the events of the past days: her father's betrayal, the desperate flight from Silver Creek, Preston's injury. And beneath it all, a growing awareness of feelings she hadn't dared to examine too closely. She rose from the bed and padded quietly to the door, opening it just enough to peer into the main room. Preston still lay on the sofa, his chest rising and falling in the even rhythm of sleep. Thomas sat nearby in a rocking chair, a rifle across his lap standing guard against any threat that might come in the night. Reassured by the sight, Katherine returned to bed and finally surrendered to exhaustion, drifting into the deepest sleep she'd experienced in days. Morning arrived with the scent of coffee and bacon, drawing Katherine from slumber. For a moment, she was disoriented, the unfamiliar surroundings confusing her sleep-fogged mind. Then memory returned in a rush and she sat up quickly, eager to check on Preston. She dressed in the borrowed clothes, a simple blue calico dress that was slightly large but serviceable, and made her way to the main room. Preston was awake, propped up on the sofa with pillows. Some color returned to his face, though pain still shadowed his eyes. "Good morning," he said when he saw her, a smile warming his features. "You look rested." Katherine returned his smile, relief flooding through her at seeing him alert. "How are you feeling?" "Better," Preston assured her. "Thomas says the bullet didn't hit anything vital." "I'll be sore for a while, but I'll heal. If he doesn't try riding or fighting or other fool things too soon," Thomas added, entering from the kitchen with a pot of coffee. "Morning, Miss Norris. Sleep well." "Better than I have in days," Katherine admitted, accepting a cup of coffee gratefully. "Thank you again for taking us in." "Like I said, no thanks needed." Thomas poured coffee for Preston as well. "I've been thinking about your situation. Blackstone's men will likely track you to Fort Benton eventually. This town's not big enough to hide in for long." Katherine's stomach tightened at the reminder that their ordeal wasn't truly over. "What do you suggest?" "Steamboat leaves for Helena tomorrow morning," Thomas said. "Sarah's sister lives there, owns a boarding house. You could stay with her until you decide your next move." "Helena," Preston repeated thoughtfully. "That's a fair distance from Silver Creek." "Far enough that Blackstone's influence won't reach," Thomas confirmed. "And it's a growing city. Opportunities for both of you if you decide to stay." The suggestion that they would stay together, continue on as a pair, sent a flutter through Katherine's chest. She glanced at Preston, wondering if he shared the assumption. His eyes met hers, something unreadable flickering in their depths before he looked away. "It's a good suggestion," he said carefully, "though Katherine may have other plans." Katherine faltered, uncertain how to respond. Did she have other plans? Beyond escaping Holden Blackstone, she hadn't thought much about her future. And now, the idea of continuing on without Preston seemed somehow wrong, like a story ending in the middle of a chapter. She was saved from having to formulate an answer by Sarah's appearance, announcing that breakfast was ready. They gathered around the kitchen table, Preston moving stiffly, but insisting on joining them rather than eating on the sofa, and for a time, the conversation turned to lighter topics. After breakfast, Thomas left for his work at the smithy, and Sarah went to the market, leaving Katherine and Preston alone in the house with instructions to rest and recover their strength. A slightly awkward silence fell between them as Katherine cleared the breakfast dishes and Preston eased himself back onto the sofa. "Katherine," he finally said, his voice soft in the quiet room, "we should talk about what happens next." She set down the dish she was drying and turned to face him. "Yes, I suppose we should." "Helena seems like a good option," Preston continued. "Safe with opportunities for you to build a new life." "For me," Katherine echoed, noting his choice of words. "Not for us." Preston's gaze dropped to his hands. "I told you I was planning to go to Oregon to join Clara's family." "Oh," Katherine tried to hide the disappointment that washed over her. "Of course, I remember." "But," Preston added, looking up to meet her eyes again, "plans can change." A tentative hope fluttered in Katherine's chest. "What are you saying, Preston?" He shifted, wincing slightly as the movement pulled at his wound. "I'm saying that these past days with you, They've changed something in me, made me see possibilities I hadn't considered before. He took a deep breath. I'm saying that if you wanted me to stay in Helena with you, I would. Katherine moved to sit beside him on the sofa, careful not to jostle his injury. Why would you do that? Preston reached out, taking her hand in his. His palm was rough with calluses, warm against her skin. Because I think I'm falling in love with you, Katherine Norris, he said simply. And that's not something a man walks away from if he has any choice in the matter. Katherine stared at him, her heart thundering in her chest. The declaration was unexpected, yet somehow not surprising at all, as if some part of her had known, had felt the same shift he described. Preston, she began, but was interrupted by an urgent knocking at the door. They both froze, exchanging alarmed glances. Preston reached for his revolver, which Thomas had left on the table beside the sofa. "Who is it?" Katherine called, moving cautiously toward the door. "Thomas Dawson sent me," came a young man's voice. "Said to tell you Blackstone's men are in town, asking questions at the livery." Katherine opened the door to find a boy of perhaps 15, his expression anxious. "They're looking for a man and woman matching your description," he continued. "Thomas says you need to leave now. He's arranging passage on a freight wagon heading to Helena this afternoon." Cold fear replaced the warmth that had filled Katherine moments earlier. "Thank you," she told the boy. "Tell Thomas we'll be ready." When the boy had gone, Katherine turned back to Preston, who was already struggling to his feet. "You shouldn't be moving," she protested. "No choice," Preston grimaced. "If Blackstone's men find us here, they'll burn this place to the ground with us in it." They gathered their few belongings quickly, Preston moving with determined purpose despite the pain evident in his tight expression. Katherine found paper and pen to leave a note for Sarah, explaining their hasty departure and expressing gratitude for the Dawsons' kindness. By the time Thomas returned 30 minutes later, they were ready to leave. "Wagons waiting at the back," Thomas said without preamble. "Driver's a friend, he'll get you to Helena safely." He handed Preston a revolver to replace the one he'd lost during their flight, just in case. "We can't thank you enough," Katherine said, embracing the gruff man impulsively. Thomas patted her back awkwardly. "Just be careful. And tell my sister to write more often." They slipped out the back door and into a covered wagon loaded with supplies bound for Helena. The driver, a weathered man introduced only as Jeremiah, nodded curtly as they climbed aboard, making no comment on Preston's obvious injury or their furtive manner. As the wagon rumbled out of Fort Benton by a back road, Katherine caught a glimpse of riders entering the town from the south. 4 men, one with his arm in a sling. Holden Blackstone had found their trail again. But by the time the Blackstone party reached the Dawson home, Katherine and Preston were miles away, bouncing along a rutted trail toward Helena and whatever future awaited them there. The journey to Helena was arduous, particularly for Preston. The constant jolting of the wagon over rough terrain aggravated his wound, and by the second day, fever had set in, a worrying sign that infection might be taking hold. "We need to stop," Katherine told Jeremiah as Preston's skin burned hotter under her palm. "He needs rest and medicine." The driver glanced back at Preston's flushed face and nodded grimly. "There's a way station 10 miles ahead. They'll have a bed and maybe medicine." Those 10 miles seemed to stretch endlessly as Katherine cradled Preston's head in her lap, wiping his brow with a damp cloth and murmuring reassurances he was likely too delirious to comprehend. The way station, when they finally reached it, was a humble establishment, a sturdy log building that served as both tavern and inn, with a stable for horses and accommodations for travelers along the Helena road. The proprietor, a grizzled man named Jenkins, took one look at Preston and called for his wife, who apparently served as the nearest thing to a doctor for 20 miles in any direction. "Bullet wounds infected," Mrs. Jenkins declared after examining Preston in a small room at the back of the inn. "Needs cleaning and proper medicine or he'll lose more than blood." "Can you help him?" Katherine asked, clutching Preston's limp hand as he tossed restlessly on the narrow bed. The older woman nodded, already rolling up her sleeves. Done it before. But it won't be pretty and it'll hurt him considerable. Do whatever you must, Katherine said firmly. Just save him. What followed was a harrowing hour as Mrs. Jenkins reopened the wound, cleaned it thoroughly with a foul-smelling solution, and packed it with a poultice of herbs Katherine didn't recognize. Preston, semi-conscious through most of the procedure, groaned and thrashed until Jeremiah and Mr. Jenkins were forced to hold him down. When it was finally over, Preston lay quiet, his breathing shallow but regular, his face slick with sweat but cooler to the touch than before. He's strong, Mrs. Jenkins said, washing blood from her hands in a basin. Good chance he'll pull through if the fever breaks by morning. Katherine sank into a chair beside the bed, exhaustion washing over her in waves. Thank you, she whispered. I don't know how I'll ever repay you. Mrs. Jenkins waved away the thanks. Been patching up men too stubborn to die for 40 years, she said matter-of-factly. One more won't break me. She studied Katherine's tired face. You need rest too, girl. There's a room next door where you can sleep. But Katherine shook her head. I'll stay with him. The older woman's expression softened slightly. He's your husband? No, Katherine admitted, but he saved my life multiple times. And I? She trailed off, uncertain how to express the tangle of emotions that bound her to the man lying before her. Mrs. Jenkins nodded as if Katherine had finished the thought. I'll bring you some food and coffee. You'll need your strength too. Throughout the night, Katherine maintained her vigil, wiping Preston's brow when fever made him restless, holding his hand when he called out in delirium. Sometimes he seemed to recognize her, his green eyes focusing briefly on her face before sliding away into fever dreams. Other times he spoke to people who weren't there, his cousin Clara, his parents, comrades from the war. Near dawn, he became more agitated, his head tossing on the pillow as he muttered incoherently. Katherine leaned closer, trying to make sense of his words. Don't, he mumbled, his hand clutching at the blanket. Don't take her, Katherine, no, please. Essachich, Katherine soothed, stroking his hair back from his damp forehead. I'm here, Preston, I'm safe. His eyes flew open, wild with fever and fear. Katherine, he gasped, reaching for her. Yes, she said, catching his hand in hers. I'm right here, you're safe, we both are. Preston's gaze fixed on her face, clarity briefly replacing confusion. Don't leave, he whispered. Never, Katherine promised, pressing his hand to her cheek. Rest now. As if her words were a talisman, Preston's eyes drifted closed again, but this time his breathing grew deeper, more regular. When Katherine touched his forehead, the burning heat of fever had subsided to a more natural warmth. She must have dozed off shortly after, for the next thing she knew, sunlight was streaming through the small window, and Mrs. Jenkins was gently shaking her awake. Your man's fever broke, the older woman said without preamble. Thought you'd want to know. Katherine straightened, wincing at the stiffness in her neck from sleeping in the chair. Preston was still asleep, but his color was better, his breathing deep and even. He'll live then, she asked, hope rising in her chest. Mrs. Jenkins nodded. Barring any further complications, yes. Though he won't be fit for travel for at least 2 days. Jeremiah, when consulted, agreed to wait. Cargo ain't perishable, he said with a shrug. And Helene'll still be there in a few days. For the next 2 days, Katherine rarely left Preston's side as he drifted in and out of sleep, gradually growing stronger. When he was awake, they spoke little. He was too weak for extended conversation, and there seemed to be an unspoken agreement to postpone their interrupted discussion until he was stronger. On the 3rd morning, Katherine entered the room after breakfast to find Preston sitting up in bed, his color much improved, though he still looked thinner and more drawn than when they'd left Silver Creek. Good morning, he said, his voice stronger than it had been since the fever. Mrs. Jenkins says I have you to thank for my continued presence on this earth. Katherine shook her head, settling into the chair beside the bed. Mrs. Jenkins is the one who treated your wound. I just sat with you. She says you didn't leave my side for 2 days, Preston persisted. That's more than just sitting. Katherine busied herself pouring water from a pitcher, avoiding his gaze. You would have done the same for me. Yes, Preston agreed softly. I would have. She handed him the water, finally meeting his eyes. They were clear now, free of fever's glaze, and fixed on her with an intensity that made her heart skip. Before we were interrupted, Preston began carefully, I was telling you something important. Katherine nodded, her throat suddenly dry despite not being the one who had suffered from fever. You said you were falling in love with me. And you were about to respond when Blackstone's men found us in Fort Benton, Preston continued. I've been wondering, during my more lucid moments, what you might have said. Katherine looked down at her hands, folded tightly in her lap. When she had fled Silver Creek, she had been running from a forced marriage to a man she feared. The idea that, less than a week later, she would find herself contemplating feelings for another man would have seemed absurd. Yet here she was, her heart racing at the mere thought of Preston Hayes, a man who had risked everything to save her from a fate worse than death. A man who had shown her kindness, respect, and a tenderness she had never expected to find in the harsh territory of Montana. I think, she said slowly, choosing her words with care, that I might be falling in love with you too. The smile that broke across Preston's face was like sunrise after the longest night, brilliant and warming. He reached for her hand, his grip stronger than she had expected. Then I have another question, he said. When we reach Helena, would you consider becoming my wife? Not right away, he added hastily. We'll take time to know each other properly, court as people should, but I want you to know that's my intention if you'll have me. Katherine stared at him, momentarily speechless. Preston, you barely know me. I know enough, he insisted. I know you're brave and kind and stronger than anyone I've ever met. I know you stand by those you care for, even when it puts you in danger. His grip on her hand tightened. And I know that since the moment I found you in that barn, ready to flee rather than submit to a marriage without love, I haven't been able to imagine my future without you in it. Tears pricked at Katherine's eyes as his words washed over her. Yes, she whispered. When we reach Helena, I would be honored to court you, Preston Hayes. And if, after knowing each other better, you still wish to marry me, then nothing would make me happier. Preston lifted her hand to his lips, pressing a gentle kiss to her knuckles. Then it's settled, he said, his voice rough with emotion. Helena will be our new beginning. 2 days later, with Preston well enough to travel though still weak, they resumed their journey to Helena. The terrain grew more mountainous as they approached the territorial capital, the scenery increasingly spectacular with towering peaks and verdant valleys. Helena itself, when they finally arrived, was a bustling city that bore little resemblance to the quiet streets of Silver Creek. Built on the wealth of gold discovered in Last Chance Gulch, the city boasted grand buildings, crowded streets, and an energy that spoke of opportunity and prosperity. Sarah's sister, Margaret Wilson, welcomed them warmly to her boarding house, a 3-story structure on a respectable street not far from the city center. After hearing a sanitized version of their situation, she insisted on giving them her best rooms at a reduced rate, until you find your feet. The next weeks passed in a whirlwind as Katherine and Preston established themselves in their new home. Preston, once recovered from his wound, found work as a wrangler for a freight company, his skill with horses quickly earning him respect and decent wages. Katherine, to her surprise, secured a position as an assistant at the Territorial Library, her education and quick mind impressing the head librarian. In the evenings, they courted properly, Preston calling at the boarding house to escort Katherine on walks through the city, to church socials, or occasionally to dinner at one of Helena's finer establishments when funds allowed. They talked for hours, learning each other's histories, dreams, and quirks. With each passing day, Katherine found herself falling deeper in love with the quiet, honorable man who had risked everything to save her. 3 months after their arrival in Helena, Preston proposed properly, with a small gold ring he'd saved for weeks to purchase. They were married in the Episcopal Church on a crisp October morning, with Margaret Wilson and several new friends from the city in attendance. As Katherine spoke her vows, gazing into Preston's steady green eyes, she marveled at the journey that had brought them to this moment. She had fled Silver Creek with nothing but the clothes on her back and fear in her heart. Now she stood beside a man who had given up everything: his job, his plans, nearly his life, to ensure her freedom and happiness. "I now pronounce you man and wife," the minister declared, and Preston leaned down to place a gentle kiss on Katherine's lips there first, as he had insisted on waiting until they were properly wed. At the small reception that followed at Margaret's boarding house, Preston drew Katherine aside, his expression unusually solemn. "I have something to tell you," he said, taking her hands in his. "I received a letter yesterday from a friend in Silver Creek." Katherine tensed, fear flickering briefly at the mention of the town she had fled. "What did it say?" "Your father is dead," Preston said gently. "Apparently he drank himself into an early grave shortly after we left. I'm sorry, Katherine." Katherine absorbed the news with a complex mixture of emotions. Her father had betrayed her in the worst way possible, yet he was still the man who had once carried her on his shoulders through fields of wildflowers. "And the Blackstones?" she asked, pushing aside grief to deal with later. "Still looking for us, according to my friend, but they've focused their search on Oregon, believing that's where we headed." Preston squeezed her hands reassuringly. "We're safe here, Katherine," she nodded, grateful for the reassurance. "There's something else I should tell you as well," she said. "Something I only learned for certain yesterday." Preston's brow furrowed with concern. "What is it?" Katherine placed his hand against her still flat stomach, a smile blooming on her face. "We're going to have a baby, Preston. Next spring." The joy that transformed Preston's features was worth every hardship they had endured. He lifted her in a gentle embrace, mindful of her condition, and spun her in a circle, his laughter drawing curious glances from their guests. "A baby," he repeated in wonder when he set her down. "Our baby." In that moment, with her husband's arms around her and new life growing within her, Katherine felt a sense of completeness she had never expected to find. From the darkest moment of her life, her father trading her away like property, had come the greatest joy she could imagine. 6 months later, as spring blossomed across the Montana Territory, Katherine gave birth to a healthy son they named Thomas, after the man who had helped them in Fort Benton. Preston held the tiny infant with wonder, his green eyes filled with tears as he counted perfect fingers and toes. "He's beautiful," Preston whispered, placing their son in Katherine's arms, "just like his mother." Katherine smiled tiredly, her heart so full it seemed impossible to contain. "He has your eyes," she observed, stroking the wispy hair on their son's head. As they gazed at their child, a knock sounded at the door of their small but comfortable home, a cottage they had purchased on the outskirts of Helena with their combined savings. Preston answered to find a messenger boy with a telegram. His expression grew serious as he read its contents. "What is it?" Katherine asked, instantly alert to his change in mood. Preston returned to her bedside, holding out the telegram for her to read. "It's from Eliza Dawson," he explained. "Walter Blackstone is dead, heart failure, and Holden." He shook his head in disbelief. "Holden Blackstone was killed in a barroom brawl in but last week." Katherine stared at the telegram, then at her husband. "It's over," she whispered. "Truly over," Preston nodded, sitting beside her on the bed and wrapping an arm around her shoulders. "We're free, Katherine. We don't have to look over our shoulders anymore." As the significance of the news sank in, Katherine looked down at their sleeping son, then up at Preston, the man who had given up everything to save her, only to gain a family and a future neither of them had dared to imagine when they fled Silver Creek that fateful night. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked softly. "Giving back the land and cattle to save me, leaving everything behind." Preston's smile was answer enough, but he spoke the words she would treasure for the rest of her days. "Katherine Hayes, I would give up every acre and every head of cattle in Montana territory for just one day with you and our son. Some things can't be measured in land or livestock, and what we have is worth more than all the wealth Blackstone ever possessed." As he sealed his words with a kiss, Katherine knew with absolute certainty that her father's cruelest act, trading her for land and cattle, had led her to the truest love she could ever have imagined. And in Preston's arms, with their son nestled between them, she had found a home more precious than any land deed could ever convey. 1 year later, Katherine stood on the porch of their expanded cottage, watching as Preston taught young Thomas to pet their gentle mare. The boy, barely walking but fearless, giggled as the horse lipped at his outstretched hand. Their life in Helena had prospered beyond expectation. Preston had been promoted to head wrangler at the freight company, while Katherine had resumed part-time work at the library now that Thomas was a bit older. Their home, once a modest cottage, now boasted additional rooms and a proper stable for Preston's horses. As she observed her husband and son, a letter clutched in her hand, Katherine marveled at how completely her life had transformed in just 2 years. From the desperate young woman fleeing an arranged marriage to the contented wife and mother, she was now, the journey seemed almost unbelievable. "What's that smile for?" Preston asked, approaching with Thomas balanced on his hip. Katherine held up the letter. "It's from Eliza. She's coming to visit next month." She hesitated, then added, "And she's bringing news about the Norris property." Preston's expression grew serious as he set Thomas down to toddle around the yard. "What about it?" "Apparently, after my father died, it went up for auction to settle his debts," Katherine explained. "The Blackstone Ranch bought it, but with both Walter and Holden gone, the new manager is selling off parcels they don't need." She took a deep breath. "Eliza says we could buy it back for a reasonable price if we wanted to." Preston studied her face carefully. "Do you want to?" "Go back to Silver Creek, I mean?" Katherine considered the question, looking around at the home they had built, the life they had created. "No," she finally said. "Silver Creek isn't home anymore, this is." She gestured to encompass their property, their son, the life they shared. "I just thought you should know the option exists." Preston smiled, pulling her into an embrace. "I'd follow you anywhere, Katherine Hayes, back to Silver Creek, to Oregon, or to the ends of the earth if that's what you wanted." "I know," she said softly, resting her head against his chest. "That's why I don't need to go anywhere at all." As the sunset painted the Montana sky in shades of gold and crimson, Katherine watched their son playing in the yard of their Helena home, secure in the knowledge that their future was exactly where it was meant to be. Preston had once given back land and cattle to save her from a loveless marriage, but what he had given her since then was worth infinitely more. Love, family, and a life built on choice rather than obligation. In the end, it wasn't land or property that made a home. It was the people you chose to build your life with, and Katherine had chosen better than she could ever have imagined on that desperate night when Preston Hayes had offered her escape, and unwittingly, a future filled with love.